Ethiopia is often described as a nation with 3,000 years of history, a land of ancient kings, biblical legends, and unbroken sovereignty. But is this the whole story? Or is it a myth, crafted to unite a diverse and often divided land? The story of Ethiopia often begins with the Aksumite kingdom, a mighty empire that thrived between the 1st and 7th centuries. Aksum controlled vast trade routes, minted its own coins, and even adopted Christianity before most of Europe. But here's the reality. Aksum was not Ethiopia. Its heartland lay in Tigray, a northern Ethiopia region, and Eritrea extending into southern Yemen. It was a trading empire, not a unified nation-state. Yet the legend of a continuous Ethiopian civilization ignores this distinction. It erases the independent histories of Ethiopia's many peoples. While Aksum is a source of pride for many Ethiopians, it was not a nation-state. Its influence did not extend to the vast central, southern, western, and eastern regions of modern Ethiopia. The idea of a 3,000-year-old Ethiopia ignores this crucial fact. After Aksum's decline, the Ethiopian highlands were separately ruled by a series of kingdoms, such as the Zagwe dynasty, who built the complex of rock-hewn churches in Lalibela, and the so-called Solomonic dynasty, mainly centered in Gondar and Shewa. These kingdoms were powerful around their centers of power, but their control was limited to the highlands. The Oromo, Somali, Sidama, and other groups in the south, east, and west lived independently, with their own cultures, languages, and political systems. These regions were not part of a unified Ethiopia. They were separate entities, often at odds with the highland kingdoms. The idea of a 3,000-year-old Ethiopia erases their distinct histories and identities. Even within the highlands, unity was an illusion. The rulers of Gondar and Shewa often clashed over dominance and territorial issues, each seeing themselves as the true inheritors of the Solomonic legacy. In the mid-19th century, Emperor Tawadros II sought to unify these fractured territories of Gondar and Shewa, yet he faced resistance even from those who claimed the same heritage. His rule was marked by wars with local nobles and external pressures, ultimately leading to his dramatic downfall. Emperor Yohannes IV, who ruled mainly in Tigray, initially opposed Tawadros, but later became a key player in the struggle for control. Their alliance was mainly focused on fighting the Mahdists from Sudan. However, Yohannes' power was largely regional, with little influence beyond Tigray and parts of northern Ethiopia. His reign was marked by conflicts with the Mahdists from Sudan and Khedive of Egypt in Eritrean highlands, and power struggles with Menelik of Shewa. After Yohannes' death in battle, Menelik capitalized on the power vacuum and expanded even further. The modern borders of Ethiopia were largely shaped in the late 19th and early 20th centuries under Emperor Menelik II. Menelik expanded the empire, conquering vast territories in the south, west, and east. This was not a reunification of ancient lands, but an imperial project, bringing diverse peoples under one crown by force. Let's look at some specific examples of how Menelik expanded Ethiopia's borders through military campaigns. One of the most significant expansions was into Oromia, the homeland of the Oromo people. In the 1880s and 1890s, Menelik launched a series of brutal campaigns to subjugate the Oromo. The Battle of Anoel in 1886 is a stark example. After defeating the Oromo, Menelik's forces carried out mass executions and mutilations to instill fear and suppress resistance. Imagine the pain and loss inflicted on those communities, scars that remain to this day. Menelik's conquest of Oromia was not a peaceful integration. It was a violent subjugation that left deep scars. Today, the Oromo make up Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, but their incorporation into Ethiopia is only about 130 years old. Menelik also turned his attention to the south, where independent kingdoms like the Sidama, Kaffa, and Walaita thrived. The Kingdom of Kaffa, known for its coffee and rich culture, was conquered in 1897 after a fierce resistance. Menelik's forces destroyed Kaffa's capital, Bonga, and incorporated the region into Ethiopia by force. Similarly, the Sidama and Walaita peoples were subjugated through military campaigns. These regions were not part of Aksum or the medieval kingdoms. Their history as part of Ethiopia begins with Menelik's conquests. In the east, Menelik expanded into Somali-inhabited territories such as the Ogaden region. The Somali people, who had long lived as pastoral nomads, resisted Menelik's forces, but were ultimately outnumbered and overpowered. The incorporation of these territories into Ethiopia created tensions that persist to this day. Like the Oromo and Southern Kingdoms, the Somali territories were not historically part of Ethiopia. Their inclusion was the result of military conquest, not a shared 3,000-year history. Ethiopia's expansion coincided with the scramble for Africa, when European powers carved up the continent. Ethiopia's victory at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 secured its independence, but it also allowed Menelik to expand his empire without European interference. Menelik's expansion didn't reach Eritrea, which was under Italy. But later, after Italy's defeat by the British, Eritrea was briefly federated to Ethiopia during the Haile Selassie regime and was forcefully annexed as a province for a few decades. However, Eritreans fought a long struggle for independence and liberated their country. Eritrea's liberation shows that Ethiopia could not be held together by force. But it also raises a question: why did Eritrea succeed to break free where others have not? Many other regions that lacked colonial borders to justify independence remained within Ethiopia, despite ongoing opposition. Throughout the 20th century, many ethnic groups, including the Oromo Liberation Front (OLF), the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF), the Ogaden National Liberation Front (ONLF), and others, waged struggles against the Ethiopian state, seeing it not as their nation but as an expansionist empire. Men and women gave their lives for these causes, fighting for the self-determination they believed they deserved. These rebellions reflect deep grievances about forced incorporation and political domination. Unlike Eritrea, many of Ethiopia's regions lack colonial-era boundaries to support claims for independence. The Oromo, Sidama, Somali, and others were incorporated into Ethiopia through conquest, not treaties. Their borders were drawn by Ethiopian rulers, not international agreements. This makes their struggle for self-determination far more complex. Without clear historical or legal boundaries, these regions face an uphill battle for recognition on the world stage. Yet their grievances remain unresolved, fueling ongoing tensions within Ethiopia. To understand why Ethiopia's regions resist the idea of a 3,000-year-old unified history, we must look at their distinct historical trajectories. The Oromo people, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, have a rich history that predates their incorporation into Ethiopia. For centuries, they governed themselves through the Gada system, a democratic and egalitarian political system. The Gada system organized Oromo society into age sets, with leaders elected by the community. It was a system of governance, not a kingdom, and it thrived independently of the Ethiopian highlands. The Oromo's history is one of self-governance and resistance. Their incorporation into Ethiopia was not a reunion with an ancient state, but a violent imposition of foreign rule. The Sidama people of southern Ethiopia have their own unique history and culture. Their Fitchambalala festival, a New Year celebration, dates back centuries and reflects their agricultural traditions and social cohesion. The Sidama were not part of Aksum or the medieval kingdoms. Their history is tied to their land, not to a mythical 3,000-year-old Ethiopia. Like the Oromo, the Sidama were incorporated into Ethiopia by force. Their history is not a chapter in Ethiopia's story, but a separate narrative that deserves recognition. The Somali people of eastern Ethiopia have a history shaped by nomadic pastoralism and resistance to outside rule. Their clans and lineages have governed themselves for centuries, with a strong emphasis on oral tradition and communal decision-making. The Somali were not part of Ethiopia's ancient or medieval kingdoms. Their incorporation into Ethiopia was a result of Menelik's expansion, not a shared history. The Somalis' history is one of resilience and independence. Their struggle for recognition within Ethiopia reflects their desire to preserve their unique identity. In the 20th century, Ethiopia became a modern state. Emperor Haile Selassie promoted the idea of a 3,000-year-old Ethiopia to foster unity, but this narrative ignored the realities of conquest and incorporation. The Derg regime tried to impose a socialist vision of unity, but it only deepened divisions. Today, Ethiopia is a federal state, but its unity remains fragile. The regions added by force in the last 150 years have their own histories, cultures, and aspirations. The myth of a 3,000-year-old Ethiopia cannot erase these realities. Ethiopia's current federal system, established in 1995 by EPRDF, was designed to address these divisions. It grants ethnic regions significant autonomy, even enshrining the right to secession in Article 39 of the Constitution. But here's the catch. Secession is not as simple as it sounds. Ethiopia's regional boundaries are not set in stone. They were drawn by politics, not history. If one region were to secede, where would its borders begin and end? Take Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital, located in Oromia. Would it remain part of Ethiopia or become an enclave within an independent Oromia? What about cities like Dire Dawa, home to multiple ethnic groups? And let's not forget the countless border disputes between regions, Amhara and Tigray, Somali and Oromia. These are not just lines on a map, they are flashpoints for conflict, and those conflicts are still happening today. In fact, the way Ethiopian regions are currently behaving, it's as if they are already preparing for a potential fragmentation, a balkanization. The intense border dispute between Tigray and Amhara in Raya and Welkayet areas, for example, demonstrates this starkly. If these regions truly saw themselves as mere administrative units of a unified country, they wouldn't be engaging in such high-stakes territorial clashes. This behavior reveals a profound fragility, suggesting that the very idea of a cohesive Ethiopian nation is under immense strain. Even if a region were to secede, how would it survive economically without a carefully planned exit, similar to Brexit, where trade, infrastructure, and resource-sharing agreements are negotiated with the other regions? Over the last century, Ethiopia's regions became deeply interconnected. Oromia has fertile land but relies on roads through Amhara. Tigray has industry but is landlocked. Somali has natural gas but lacks infrastructure. Secession doesn't just mean independence, it means navigating a minefield of economic and political challenges. Ethiopia's federal system is a bold experiment, but it is also a fragile one. It promises unity through diversity, but it also risks fragmentation. The current conflicts throughout Ethiopia show this. The question is, can Ethiopia hold together, or will it fracture under the weight of its own contradictions? Yes, Ethiopia is more than a myth. It is a diverse and dynamic nation, shaped by both ancient legacies and modern realities. But to build a truly united future, we must confront the truth. Ethiopia is not a 3,000-year-old nation. It is a modern state, forged by conquest and compromise. What do you think? Can Ethiopia embrace its complex history and build a shared future? Let us know in the comments.